Welcome to Baptist Bridges, a podcast by the Canadian Baptists of Ontario and Quebec. We will explore a variety of topics that we trust will be meaningful to people and churches around the world. We're glad you're here. Hello, everybody. I'm your host, Leanne Friesen. Today, we're going to talk about a topic that may get a response from some of us. I've titled this topic, The Post-Pandemic Church. Now, if you're like me and you're serving in ministry during the pandemic, or I think really anyone who lived through the pandemic, we are just sick of that word, and it may actually bring up a lot of emotions for us. But as I've come to be visiting our churches and connecting to churches all throughout our CBOQ family, in this year, 2024, I'm discovering that we are still processing how the pandemic shaped and changed us and who we are as a church in this new season. We had a time where we were sort of getting through the pandemic. We had to just get through it, and then we had to recover from it. But now I think it's so important to ask, what will it look like to move forward, recognizing the ways that we experience change and shift because of that pandemic? Now, I've got two wonderful guests here today, Elden Faulkner and Leaslie Makins, who are both pastors in Hamilton. And these are two folks that served in different areas in Hamilton, but have slightly different roles, and I think are such a perfect example of some of the differences churches experienced, how they did things differently. And of course, because they were both from my home association, the Niagara Hamilton Association, during the pandemic, and full confession, Leaslie was actually my associate pastor for Mount Hamilton Baptist. I knew a little bit more of their experiences, which made me really sense that we'd be able to have a good conversation. So I'd love them to just introduce themselves a bit. Let's start with you, Elden. Tell me about where you are.
Sure. I'm Elden Faulkner. I've been here at Harmony Baptist Church in Hamilton, just in the south end of Hamilton for 15 years. August 1st was 15 years for me here.
That's amazing.
In this church. So great place to be. Love Hamilton, love our church, and we're in a smaller church. Pre-pandemic, if we're going to use that word, we were probably average Sunday attendance 125 people, and we're currently a church of about 100 people post-pandemic, although many of those faces have changed. We'll talk more about that later.
Absolutely. You know, and one of my favorite things about Harmony, shout out to Harmony. Now, some of you might have seen their video of their amazing live nativity that was on Huntley Street, but they have for years run the most incredible summer camp ministry called Boomerang, and just great youth ministry and programming there. So we appreciate so much what you do. And Leaslie, tell us a bit about you.
Well, I'm Leaslie Makins. I'm one of the pastors at Mount Hamilton Baptist Church. I've been there 8.5 years now, and it's been great. I don't preach every week, but I do all kinds of other stuff.
I was so intentional of having a lead pastor and an associate as well that had sort of slightly different ways that they had to engage during the pandemic and different roles and how that plays out. And Leaslie had a very difficult lead pastor. It was me. And
but that
full of great ideas.
We can talk about that more. So I'd like to dig in with a review, and I feel like it should come with a trigger warning, to be honest, because even when I wrote it out, I thought, wow, we lived through a lot. So this is my best memory. Early March 2020, we all remember there's an announcement that large gatherings should take extra precautions. If you're like us, we bought gloves to serve communion. We were like, yay us. But followed within just a day or two by announcement that it was a full lockdown, which was going to be 3 weeks. This was later extended to 6 weeks, then extended to several months, ultimately to about June time of that year. Then that summer, if you remember, churches could meet with social distancing. So we had to figure out how to do social distancing. Some churches decided to meet, some didn't. That continued into the fall, still social distancing. And then in November, they said churches can meet with social distancing with vaccine passports. There was all those elements. Some did, some didn't. Then a few days before Christmas, lockdown again. I actually think the passports thing might have even been the year later. So then we were locked down for Christmas. Winter, a little bit later, social distancing again. Before Easter 2021, another lockdown. Is this all right? We were in another, couldn't meet. I think that Easter there was just really strict guidelines about maybe how you could meet. But we were fully online that Easter. We had 2 Easters fully online, at least at Mount Hamilton. And then that spring, you could meet with some social distancing again. That fall, so now we're at fall 2021, right? Remember, it was going to be 3 weeks when it started. We got paper here for notes because it's a lot to remember. Meet with masks, but you had to do social distancing still. And then Christmas, we locked down again. We had 2 Christmas lockdowns. So that was the Christmas at Mount Hamilton that we had the great idea that we would meet in the parking lot. Mount Hamilton is on the escarpment of Hamilton, and I'll never forget trying to light those Christmas Eve candles, and not a one of them would light because it was so windy. And I had this vision of like, you know what? It's going to be this beautiful memory that we lit these candles outside Christmas Eve. And I went home and I went, that stunk. That just summarized the pandemic. We couldn't get a single candle to stay lit. It's exactly how I feel this Christmas, but I smiled my way through it. And then that spring was when we could start meeting. And then they said, well, now masks, you can decide yourself. Remember, that was Mount Hamilton. It wasn't required. You could, you couldn't. And then June 2022, over 2 years later, was when all restrictions were lifted. And then if we add into that all the decisions that were made around that, and again, some churches who honored those things in some ways or didn't, who tried to piece it together, and then what coming back looked like, and the slow coming back, which could take months to talk about.
When I read that list, I was like taken aback. It was just overwhelming because when you're in it, you're just doing one little step at a time. But when you read it over as a whole, it was quite, I think, whoa was the word that I used. Like, that was a lot. You know, at the time, you're just doing what you have to do, one step at a time. But to see it all in that order was kind of like, that was a lot.
It was substantial, for sure, for all of us, I think, in many different ways, right? When I read through your list and remembered back, I mean, you're right about being a bit of a trigger. It was like flashback of memories of different things and being forced into new situations, and remember difficult conversations and different opinions, both within the church and externally to it. But I'm not sure I want to go back. There's days I'd like to go back to the pandemic, to be honest. I remember pre-recording my message and then being able to have the Sunday service happen while I was up at the lake. That part was okay.
Some things were very nice.
But yeah, don't want to live through that again.
And I think the reminder of the sheer amount of, what was the word? Pivot. The pivoting.
Yeah.
So I have a confession, Leaslie. So I made for our staff these Christmas ornaments that had the word pivot with like the no smoking sign through it. Like 22 is a little gift as a memento. And this year when I took it out for Christmas, I said, I'm never hanging that ornament again. I don't want to see the word pivot. I don't want to think, even though it's like a joke and it was this reminder of how tired we were. I was like, done. Because we kind of felt that way. So when you look back at those times, how did your church engage? Give me like just an overview of what your churches were like in those times, how they responded to the changes and the struggles and the constant switching.
Constant switching is a good word for it. I think it was, I mean, it took us by surprise, right? And when we heard that there was going to be a shutdown, and we all thought, okay, a couple of weeks, we'll cancel service for a couple of weeks. That's all right. I'm going to book a little vacation or something. But when it became ongoing, I think it was a challenge. And for us, we had an older congregation at the time. Primarily, I would say, a good percentage of our congregation were people over the age of 70. And there was a lot of fear or anxiety. In hindsight, whether or not that fear was justified or not is, a different story. But people were quite cautious and not wanting to risk themselves and relationships. And so we were on the cautious side. We followed the guidelines that were given and updated and changed all the time, but we tried to keep in step with them, not doing more or less than what we were advised to do, which led to, people, some felt that we weren't being restrictive enough. We shouldn't be meeting at all. And there's others that felt like, no, just meet, who cares? This is all nonsense. So it's, I think for us, it was a matter of trying to navigate that road of understanding people's fear and being a good neighbor. Like, for myself personally, my testimony of that time is that I never really feared for my own health. I had COVID twice during that time, but I felt very strongly that to be a good neighbor, to love others as ourselves, is to respect their feelings of fear and to just give them the space that they desired. So that's kind of the way our church navigated it. We tended to be on the overly cautious side. Mm-hmm. Even when we were given the option of meeting, we stayed online.
Mm-hmm. So you shifted to online?
We immediately,
And what was that like with a mostly older congregation? Because that's an interesting dynamic. What was that journey like, those early days of
Well, the early days meant my porch visits to go and install something on their computer or iPad so they could watch us online, because people didn't know how to even do that.
Yeah.
We were very fortunate. God had brought a new family to our church just before this all happened. And the lady happened to be a YouTuber, has her own channel with all kinds. And so we had the expertise to instantly transition to online and do it well. And so that was very fortunate. God prepared us for it. The challenge was to help people be able to access that online. So we'll talk about this more later, but you'll find a lot of the people that responded to our online presence were different people than those that had been attending our church up to that point.
Yes, and that was such an interesting dynamic. So you've named so well some of the theological and then some of the practicalities of what pastors were dealing with, right? What does this mean to honor Scripture, to honor what Jesus has called us to do, to help our people think this through? And then just practically, that's if you think about that as pastors, right? And then my pastoral visits were helping people set up technology.
Right, very different, right?
Not my skill set. And I remember having many conversations about how to set up Facebook accounts with people, right, that didn't know how to use Facebook, because that's where the church aired. So tell us about what Mount Hamilton did.
And Zoom accounts.
Zoom meetings.
Zoom.
Yes, you tell us about Mount Hamilton.
So very similar story. Some people couldn't understand what the big deal was, didn't want to really follow the rules, which we followed according to whatever the guidelines that were presented to us. And my role in that was I led the pandemic response team. And I'm a rule follower, so we followed all the rules. And just shifting and changing along the way, getting creative. We talked about a lot of the things that you've said I resonate with. We also had to get creative when we were able to meet. So we did things like, we can't have the worship team, but Leanne can lead the music, and we can use sign language and shakers.
We use sign language.
And the choruses,
anything
to try to engage people who are sitting, as we all know, very far apart. Very similar to what you said, and just having to kind of let go of trying to control what happened with people and just continuously try to reach out, help them feel connected. That was a big theme we had about keeping people connected to each other and to the Lord.
And I think it was so interesting in those times, because we were seeing these guidelines come down to churches, and most of our CBOQ churches are small. And by small, I'm defining under 150. And their buildings, our building wasn't big, and they were very difficult to enforce in small church buildings, right? And, they would say things like 6 feet apart and all this. And I was like, well, they're clearly picturing these giant cathedrals that most of our churches aren't. And so I can only speak for Mount Hamilton, but even though pre-pandemic, 250 on a Sunday, with social distancing, we would max out at 30.
Yeah.
Because the building,
depending on the rules,
the nature of the building. Yeah. And so that was an interesting dynamic. So you look back where you've named so many different things, like your ministry's changed. Now it's online. There's these personality things. How did it impact your church? You're looking at your church now. What happened?
For Harmony, it impacted us in a number of ways. I mentioned earlier that we were a church of primarily people over the age of 70, very few children in the church. That changed big time. I think part of it, for us for worship, my wife and children stepped up and because they're all musical, and because we could record the music at home, they would record a music set every week from our home, and that would be part of the video. We went YouTube exclusively. But as a result of that, we gained an audience with people from our community that I think are unlikely to have ever walked through the door previously. And all of a sudden, they were watching and commenting on the videos and calling on the phone for things. It surprised me how much uptake there was that way. So it changed us that way. It forced us to innovate. We'd long prided ourselves on a Christmas musical that we did, big pageant kind of idea every Christmas. And I remember that first year when the lockdown was on and we couldn't meet and couldn't have everybody together and they couldn't go forward with their pageant. We thought, what are we going to do? And one of our leaders here in the church, she said, let's do a drive-through pageant. And I'm like, well, what does that look like? And so she created these different scenes from the story of the Christmas story. And we did it along outside the property here. Ended up having like 400 cars come through that year just to take in this drive-through pageant. And we would never have thought of that before. We would never have tried it. We would have just gone with the same thing we'd always done,
Yeah.
So
what about you? What were some of the impacts as you think about it?
Yeah, well, when you were talking about drive-through, it made me laugh because I was thinking about we had drive-through communion because we couldn't. Yeah, that was different. So we met them out in the parking lot, and they would circle around, and we would serve communion at their car window.
Oh.
And it was, not a ton of people came, but surprising how many people would come. So we did a couple of those kind of innovative drive-through things as well. When you said that, it made me laugh. And I remember you doing that and thinking, oh, now that's being creative, right, in a tough situation. Yeah.
And what about the long-term impact?
It's hard to measure. So I was thinking about that question. And sometimes, there were a lot of people that kind of disappeared. And then there were a lot of people that came. And it's new people that came. Some people came as a result of being online at COVID and worshiping online with our service. We had a service prior to COVID. We had an online service prior to COVID. So we were all set up. We didn't have to go through that learning curve. Some new people joined and people were participating. And some came to the church after when we started to open and said, well, I started during COVID in the online format. So gained some new faces, some beautiful people who are still part of our church. And a lot of people just disappeared. And that's very troubling to my soul, where they still consider Mount Hamilton home. They still come to special things, but they seem to have disappeared from a weekly service. Lots of new people have come, which have outweighed the people who've sort of disappeared and stepped back. Couple of people went to other denominations. We had about 5 families who went to a different denomination, kind of in the midst, midst to the end of COVID. So lots of odd shifts that maybe would have happened anyway. It's hard to know whether it's a result of COVID or not, but the timing is very interesting.
I called it the COVID shuffle. Yeah. Right? Someone's here, we were over there. And, and I think one of the things as we go into the post-pandemic church is also being honest about that, because I think sometimes I remember being at a ministerial gathering, like an ecumenical gathering, where they're like, oh, we've had so many new people. But when we did the math, it was just people from each other's churches, And so being a little more, like being honest about, we've had new people, but we've had losses. And some of our people have gone to your churches. Some of us come, and we've had new Christians. But are we willing to look at our church with honest assessment, right? So can we just list, kind of bullet point in our heads, what were some of the shifts that happened in churches because of COVID? So for example, do you still have an online service?
Yeah.
So did you have one before?
No.
So that's a shift, right? So now you have an online service. What other ones are some of the things that, like, because of COVID, this is things that we now do? Practically, I know a lot of churches no longer collect offering.
Yeah, we don't anymore.
Do you collect offering? Yeah, some do.
That
a lot don't.
That was a change for us.
Yeah.
So now we have a mailbox at the back.
Yeah.
And put their offering in or do it online. Yeah. And we don't pass the plate, as it were, anymore. And we are still using what I call the COVID communion cups.
Yes, the little cups.
Oh, people couldn't wait to get rid of those.
Well, I can't wait to get rid of them either, but they're still there. And there was I brought it up at a meeting, and someone went, "Oh no, we can't go back.
Isn't that interesting?"
Yeah, and I was like, "Oh, we really need to," but. So for now, we're still using what I call the COVID communion cup.
You name an important thing there. Like a couple years ago, I went to a big church in New York, and they had those cups, and I thought, like pre-COVID, I thought they were a riot. I brought one back for less. I was like, look at this hilarious thing. We cracked up.
Isn't this cute?
And now, right, that shift of people going, I can't go back to just regular bread, right? And that we would have thought those cups were ridiculous 5 years ago. So no bulletins. A lot of churches have stopped having bulletins. What are some other like practical things that you're like, because of COVID, this is a difference?
I think for us, probably the most immediate change that has lasted is it was like an all hands on deck. There were so few volunteers, so many people were staying away, especially as we were kind of restarting things, is anybody that was willing was stepping into a role serving. And so we have, the people serving in our church on a daily basis now looks very different from the people pre-COVID, because people that I think always thought there's somebody else, it's their job, right? Now they had an opportunity and they discovered they love serving, and so they're a part of it. So that's been a big shift for us. That, and I would say the other thing is community focus. You mentioned Boomerang Day Camp, which we've done for 12 years, but there's more, I think, because of the reaction primarily to that drive-through that we did, and people saw how they could engage with the community and how life-giving that was, and what a blessing it was to the people in the church. Now they're always looking for a new way to serve the community. So there's new opportunities, new things being tried. We're experimenting more. I think, the what did you call it? The pivot?
Yeah.
There were so many pivots that now pivoting is normal. And so we're looking, how can we do this better? What's something else we can try? And if it doesn't work, that's okay. We'll pivot and try something else. So I think that attitude shift has been huge.
That's exciting. So it sort of opened your church up to be like, we can shift and we can grow. And I think a lot of churches have had that, because I've heard more churches say, we used to do this ministry, it stopped over COVID, then we realized we didn't need to do it anymore.
Yeah.
Right? So I think that's such an important one to name. When you name about the volunteers shifting as well, I wonder if we can name, it means, forgive this term, but we all work in churches or are part of churches, forgive me, that there's power shifts in the churches,
sure.
right? So that can be a total shift in churches with like long-standing church members. If now there's new people serving, it can really kind of unsettle the way things were always done. What are some more shifts that you would say you've seen?
Yeah, I would go along with that too, that a lot of the people now who are really involved in the day-to-day ministry are some of the new people that came during COVID. And I guess each of them have a story. Some people came because of their own church situation, or some people are new to faith. But they're excited, and I think they're excited about being in a new place and getting involved in that. I think it also has prepared us that another big pandemic could come, and I think for me personally, that this doesn't mean that this is the only time we're ever going to have to react or respond to something really big. Yeah. So I think there's a certain level of confidence to know that we are how we would approach it. I think too, back when we first started, the pandemic was starting. And I was like, well, who makes the decisions? Well, we had a pandemic response policy. And I was so happy to have that policy that probably no one ever thought they would use, because it was like it just laid it all out. And we knew exactly who was going to be on the team and how the things were going to go down. And so I think it gives us confidence that we can deal with hard things.
That's awesome.
It doesn't have to be a pandemic either, right? Like I'm thinking of what's happening out west with the wildfires right now. It's like, I think for those of us in churches who sometimes fear things not being able to do the things as we've always done them, that to know that the Bible tells us that when Jesus returns, there's a church that's going to meet him. Like, the church is still here. The church isn't dying. The church isn't going to go away. So whatever comes, we just have to be willing to innovate and ask God to lead us through it. And to me, that the church has the potential in a situation like what the pandemic was, to be a voice of reason and love and respect and hope and courage during what is a difficult, challenging time for all of our neighbors. We can be that lighthouse perhaps more in a pandemic time or a crisis time than we can when everything seems to be going well and who needs the church. So I think to be ready for that, because change is going to come, crises come, and whatever that change may be, if the financial crisis happens, how does the church lean into that? So to have that attitude as a church, rather than, well, we've got to keep the doors open and how many people can come to hear me preach on Sunday, that's not what it's about. It's about giving people hope and pointing them to one who...
I think too, when it first started, and it was like, like, is the church going to fall apart? Like, those were kind of discussions that we were having, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, how are we going to get through this? Are people just going to like just stop coming to church? And there was all that kind of fear, but speaking to the idea that we can trust God to carry us through. It's his church.
Yeah.
And we, he's got people. He's got them. It's not us who are holding their faith intact. It's the Lord, right?
Well, and like you mentioned, some people have stopped coming to church, right? Mm-hmm. And that's been a challenging, as a pastor, that's a hard one to understand or really connect with, is that stopping coming to church, if they haven't gone somewhere else, is that a stopping of faith, or they found a new way to satisfy those spiritual needs that they have? I just recently baptized a lady who has been watching online since that first year that we did the drive-thru. They came to the drive-thru, found out that we did online, been watching ever since, and just recently asked to be baptized. That's a weird, they didn't train me for that in seminary, right? And doesn't plan to come and be a part of a day-to-day basis in the church. Plan for reasons they have as a family to continue watching online.
Isn't that interesting?
They want to be part of our church, and they're supporting us. So it's a different dynamic.
I love these things and that positive sign of what we learned and all those things. But I think most of us have different churches, anyone listening here, than before the pandemic. And I want to name that there's some listening and they're saying, we didn't have that experience of, we have new people. Some are like, we're barely back after the pandemic. We lost so many people. They didn't come back. We don't know what's happening. We don't know if we're going to make it. Our financial struggle. There's such a breadth of that. But what would you say, just practically in terms of people, like what percentage would be new since, if you look 2019, 2024, how much has your church shifted? You said you had about 100, a few less people, but different people.
A few less people, but probably half the congregation weren't here prior to the pandemic.
See, that's wild, right? Like that would never have happened in most of our churches.
And we're way more ethnically diverse now than we ever were before.
Yeah.
I think that's the other aspect. We were a bunch of, I don't know if I'm even allowed to say that, but old gray-haired white people prior to the pandemic. And now we're this beautiful mess of people that love Jesus from all different walks of life and different backgrounds.
So you have a different
exciting.
church. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And how about at Mount Hamilton?
We lost about, I actually looked.
I suspected she would.
We lost about 20, of people who have just kind of disappeared, whether they've left and changed to a different denomination or whether they just aren't around. So there were about 27, but we have about 38 new families.
Yeah,
so we have more new than we did before. And it's interesting because those are the people we see all the time, and they're excited about it all, right? And so it looks very different. We actually had a person who was a long-standing member of our church. He hadn't been around for a while, and I called and said, "Do you want to have coffee?" And went for coffee, and it was like, well, I feel like it's a different church. I don't really know all the people that are here now. They're all so different. So just kind of walking alongside that person to help them find out how they can fit in the new look of what they're seeing when they come to church and see some of their friends, but a whole lot of new people.
I felt that as a pastor. I remember looking out one Sunday morning and going, I don't know this church anymore. And that's overwhelming. Like remember when we all thought there'd be a big party where we all came back the same day, but it came back slowly. Yeah. And a lot of our long-term people were coming back slower. They weren't comfortable returning. And it just felt so different. I was telling someone just this story this morning, and Leaslie, you'll remember this one. It was 2022 spring. So we'd been worshiping back, like that was when you could come, but you still wore masks, but people were coming back for several months. And a woman came who hadn't been too involved in the church, but she did come every Sunday. And I had not laid eyes on her since before the pandemic, had no idea where she was, and tried to reach her, was thrilled to see her. But she hadn't been there. But we'd been meeting for several months, and even before that had been off and on meeting. And she came up to me and she said, Leanne, I have to tell you some exciting news. There was a new man in front of me today. And I said, oh, who? And she described him. And then I just said, oh, that's so-and-so. He's a member of our board now. He'd been coming very faithful for 2 years, but she hadn't been. But what was so interesting, I remember thinking, oh, this is what coming back is going to be like. Her mind didn't go, I haven't been here for 2 years, so maybe I just don't know him. Her mind went, oh, that's somebody new. And I think that summarizes what a lot of pastors went through. People expected to come back to the same church, and they didn't come back to the same church, either because different people were leading or because there's new people. People left, people passed away. We had some really long-term beloved people die during the pandemic who we couldn't have funerals for with the whole church family. Those things were hard. So I often hear people sometimes, when I'm out talking in churches, there's still this kind of narrative of when we get back to the way things were before the pandemic. And I hear people say things like, well, some people still haven't come back since the pandemic. But I wonder what you think it means to embrace our current churches as the new reality. Because I'm going to be honest, when people say, they still haven't come back, I feel like saying, I don't think they are, right? It's been a couple years. Maybe you'll see them at some point, but if they haven't come now, the church you have now is your church. This is your church right now. So what does it mean to embrace that and let go of sort of how do we make it the pre-pandemic church, either because we want to bring back the ministries we used to do, or we want to start this thing again, or how can we make it look the same or get the people back? Any thoughts on that? How we embrace that?
I think it starts with confession, and that is that, there was a lot of reaction to having to wear masks in church. But as a good Baptist, I think a lot of us were wearing masks for a long time. They just weren't physical ones.
Elden dropping the power bombs there.
People that have gone away and intentionally choosing to not come back or not attend church anymore, maybe they weren't so healthy in the first place. Like there's that, not to blame, not to say that's always the case, but I think maybe our churches weren't as healthy as we thought they were. Maybe there were people that were just showing up out of kind of cultural habit, been there faithfully for 50 years, can't imagine doing anything else. And all of a sudden they discovered on Sunday morning, they can sleep in, make pancakes and do something else because it wasn't that valuable to them. But at the same time, we have people, I think, who've come hungry to meet with Jesus and to discover relationships with each other. And so they're coming with a desire to really be here, right? They're jumping in, and I see so much enthusiasm and desire for connection. I think so many of us missed the connections during COVID that we don't take it for granted anymore. We're intentionally looking to have fellowship with one another. And so, yes, some people are gone and we grieve those losses. As pastors, I think we all grieve, no matter, even if you have to move because your job transferred you to another place, we still don't like saying goodbye, right? Your family. But the reality is some people have left us. God has brought the people to us that he wants us to minister to and with. And we have all the people resources in our church to do the job he's asking us to do today. And all we have to do is be responsible enough, faithful enough to do what he's asking us to do today with the people he's given us today. Tomorrow is another day. I think it says that somewhere in the Bible, right? So
that's so well said. I have nothing to add. Do you want to add to that at all?
That's beautiful.
It's pretty well summarized. So I'm going to ask a really pragmatic question. So Leaslie mentioned that at Mount Hamilton, we'd started an online service before the pandemic. So I did have a moment, and I got to tell you, 99% of churches, when they heard we started an online service, would say, I don't agree with that ecclesiology.
Crazy.
I don't agree with that ecclesiology. Yeah. Now, all these churches are like, we're never going to stop our online service because God teaches us new things. And we felt called to a particular thing in that time. How do we process our online services now? I think a lot of churches are trying to figure out, what do we do with this online service? Just to throw some thoughts out, is this continuing to sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? Like acquiesce to people who just want to make pancakes in the morning? Yep. Is it making it so that people aren't re-engaging? Does it still have value? How do we wrestle with that question of the online service? Let's start with you, Leaslie. What do you think?
I think that is a really good question. They're all things I've thought myself. And I've even the word with so sometimes I feel like people will say, oh, I love it because I can just do my dishes and make pancakes. And they treat it like a podcast almost, as opposed to stopping to worship together. So I always try to use the language of we're worshiping together. We're not watching. We're not watching church. We're worshiping together. But I don't know if that translates to when a person is actually at home. Some probably do, and some maybe don't. And so sometimes I think who's really participating here? Is this remember when we first had our first pandemic, when we had 125 people worshiping online, 125 families worshiping together, and now we're down to these little numbers. So sometimes I wonder, who's actually there, and how is it being treated? Is it just a way to stay home? And then I talk to people, and they say, I so appreciate that online service. I hear this all the time. I'm going, you need to tell us that, because they don't say hello. We have no idea that they are, how they use it. And a lot of them are like, I couldn't get to church today, which is exactly why we started it, for when you can't make it to church, as opposed to, I'm just going to do that because I don't feel like going to church. So I do wrestle with that as well.
My invitation to any of us listening is to be thinking about that ministry just like any other ministry. Because if it just becomes a thing that now we have to do that too, right? Like those other things. We've done that for years, so now we're just going to keep doing it. We don't, right? Like now we need to say, do we need it now? Just like we did then. Do you want to add to that comment?
I will add, because I've wrestled with this a lot. Do you encourage people to stay away by providing an online presence, or are you enabling people who perhaps are shut in or have mobility issues or have transportation issues? Are you enabling them to receive something that otherwise they can't? And like what you said, I'm concerned around the consumerism side of things, although I would suggest that there's been a fair bit of consuming in our churches for a long time, right? My perspective now is that the technology that we've kind of all learned to use to some degree of effectiveness over this has given smaller churches, like the majority of our CBOQ churches, a voice into their community and the world far greater than they ever would have had pre-pandemic. We've got people I know watching every week from across Canada, in the US. I get messages from India, from Africa. A lot of them have been, our channel is shared from people who are attending here with people from back home, wherever they moved from. So we're getting these people who are participating, who are receiving our what we have to offer every week. My concern is that although that might feed their soul, just the way TV preaching and services would have been for years and years and years that you could have watched, how do we still encourage people to seek fellowship with other believers? Because being a follower of Jesus is not a solo thing. It's not just about listening to a podcast or reading a book. It's about community. It's a way of living. And so how do we use our platform, if we want to call it that, to encourage people to seek out others to live this way of life with? Because that's what transforms communities. It's my messages are never going to transform a community, but I hope I can inspire through my messages, can inspire people to go out and transform their community, to love their neighbors as themselves, to make some connections, beyond the Baptist circles, even with those other types, because there's health in that. The body of Christ is much bigger than just us, and it's much bigger than my individual church. And so, am I afraid? I think usually that what's behind that question is less a theological question than it is a fear question of losing our platform and the people we have, and having those people around. And I think we have to be honest about that.
Let's keep asking the important questions. Does it still have a place? Is it still doing what God's called us to do? I want to just take a few moments to shift gears and talk about being a pastor in the middle of the pandemic. And there's a lot of change and loss that you went through. So I'm going to share something a friend of mine told me that her therapist said to her as she was coming out of the pandemic and discovered she was really in a bad place. And she said that she believed pastors were the forgotten group during the pandemic. They were not supported or praised like healthcare workers or frontline workers. In fact, usually pastors were trying to support the people in their church who were frontline workers, but yet they were also caregivers. So they were caregivers who were not acknowledged as caregivers. And at the same time, I believe pastors had a truly unique job that I don't think any other group had, which is that they were also policymakers. And I don't think there was any other group during the pandemic that had to do exactly what pastors had to do. And let me give you this example. What I mean by that is that, you might run a hospital, you might do the policy, but you weren't then going and changing the bedpans. You either do one or the other, right? Like, so you might have been a nurse. We're so thankful for all our frontline workers, and they were the nurse and they were caring for them, but they weren't making the policies. We had the case of, we tell people they have to wear masks, and someone we baptized 3 weeks ago calls us and says, I'm never coming to this church again because you hate me. Pastor's like, I get it, right? We're suddenly making these decisions about our churches, and then we have to care for the people that we're also making the policies for. And so she said they were the forgotten people. Does that resonate with either of you?
Well, yeah, and I had an experience early on when we first had a service, and everything was laid out so that we were following the rules, and everything was taped out, and we have chairs, so chairs were set up in certain ways. People would sign up for church, and then there was a person who came who didn't want to sit where that person needed to sit, to provide a chair for the other person who was yet to sit. And with masks and with
because
all the
chairs
noise,
were sized, so there'd be
chairs
a group of two and a
one
group of
and a
one,
two and
so
a three.
you couldn't
right?
sit in the two, or the two people didn't have a seat.
Yes, you had to. And so it caused a little bit of friction, because it was like, but you need to sit in that chair. And then it was pointed out that, and I was the one having that conversation, it was pointed out that pastors should not be having those conversations. So that was the policy and the implementation of the policies and being a pastor. And that was very quickly noted right the very first week that this is not my job to do. So we brought someone in who could actually do that, so that I could take care of other things with people, do the policies, but not be the one enforcing them, so to speak, and trying to make them actually come to life.
And Mount Hamilton was in the position to do that, but some pastors...
No, some aren't.
That weight. And I remember having that discussion with you, right? And realizing the weight, if I may, that you felt that you're like, you are a very caring person, and the responsibility you felt that if we don't follow these rules and someone gets COVID, it's on my shoulders.
Yes.
That's a big weight to carry as a pastor. And so that was a heavy thing that pastors went through. How about you? And did you feel that weight?
No, I mean, the weight was there. I think felt a little bit like a peacemaker or a bridge builder during that time of trying to help, because it's pretty polarized views on this whole thing, right? And so trying to keep people talking to one another, trying to encourage that that's what we need. Just keep talking to one another, and let's keep showing love and respect. But personally, yeah, I mean, it was the hardest ministry I've ever done. I've been a pastor for 40 years now. It's definitely the hardest ministry I've done. But I think this church specifically just loved us as pastors, cared for us. I've never received so many little notes of encouragement, phone calls, little gifts, just to say thank you for what you're doing. So I think it was a very affirming time in that sense, but certainly an exhausting time.
Yes.
I remember being so exhausted.
So post-pandemic church, we are also post-pandemic pastors. And I think we need to name that too, which includes what we carried. And sometimes it includes hurt, right? Some pastors experience personal attack, hurt, pain, like they're carrying grief, they're carrying pain. So we also need to realize how we've changed as pastors, that we're not the same pastors post-pandemic. And so as we're post-pandemic pastors, post-pandemic church, this discussion's been, I think, so meaningful for me, and I hope people listening have resonated. As a final thought, how will you help the people in your church who are still waiting for the pre-pandemic church to come back?
I think ministry doesn't change. As a pastor, I don't think anything has changed. There's always been and always will be people who are longing for something else, whether that's something in the past or something in the future. And I think our job as pastors is to point people into the present and have them be obedient to what Jesus is asking them to do that day. And none of us can promise away the rest of our lives. All I can do is wake up in the morning and say, God, help me to be who you need me to be today for the things coming at me today. And I think as pastors, it's encouraging people to continue to live I can think of a song my grandpa used to sing, "One day at a time, sweet Jesus," and that's all we can do is take it a day at a time, whether that's individually or whether that's corporately as a church. Just take it a day at a time. It doesn't mean we don't cast vision, we don't look to the future, but live in the present. It's so easy to live in the past. Things probably weren't quite as glossy as we remember them in the past. And things probably are going to be okay in the future because God is with us and we're his church and he loves us. And so we're going to be okay. And I think that's an important message to continue to encourage people with. Just, we're going to be okay. Jesus is with us.
Want to add to that, Leaslie?
I was just thinking there's a lot that doesn't change as well. But for me, one of the things that's heavy on my heart are people who are still connected, but have sort of pulled back, like that number of people you don't see them anymore, but they're still considered home. And just to continue to love them and reach out and minister and pray for them and pray for the church. Like I've had a heavy burden on my heart for praying for the church, praying for the people of the church, and welcoming new faces and not forgetting about old faces, even though there's that element of I can't be responsible for their faith, right? Like I can't carry that burden, and I tend to carry things like that would be something I would carry. So a wise person once told me how we can't be responsible for other people's faith journeys. And so to let go a little bit and not carry that heavily, but to move forward as you have all along and just put one foot in front of the other and seek God's guidance and pray and ask God to help shape and move you the way to where you need to go. What's our calling now? What are you calling us to now?
Because it's about relationship, right? And it's whether people that are in the pew on Sunday morning are not more valuable than anybody else on my contact list. So it's a matter of whether they've never been to church and are unlikely to ever come, or someone that's been for 50 years and has now stopped. I think we continue to just love and respect and invest and pray for them, and continue to be their pastor. I have people in my community that consider me their pastor who've never been to church anywhere ever. Mm-hmm. They consider me their pastor. To me, that's an honor, and that's a relationship thing. So we just continue that.
What a truly pastoral thing to say. Our pastors are such special people. And so let me end by thanking you both for your faithful ministry during the pandemic, and all the people listening here, whether you're a pastor or a member of a church or a leader, we all lived through it. And thank you for your faithfulness in those times and for your continued faithfulness. And we will continue to trust God for the post-pandemic church. And as you said, God's church is always at work. God is always at work in God's church. And so we thank God for that. Thanks for joining us and being our guest today. And thanks to all of you for being here for Baptist Bridges. And we hope we'll see you next time.
Tune in next week for a new episode of Baptist Bridges.